Greetings, dear listeners. This is Jonah Goldberg, host of the Remnant podcast, brought to you by the Dispatch and Dispatch Media. Extremely excited about today's episode. I know I say that quite often, but it's actually always sincere, and it's especially so this time. A friend of the podcast, Chris Starwalt, told me months ago that Christopher Cox, former Republican congressman, former chairman of the SEC, currently a senior scholar in residence at the University of California, and chair of the Rhodes Scholarship, this or that, and all the usual encomiums and academic feathers in his cap, was writing a biography of Woodrow Wilson. And longtime listeners, even short-time listeners, know my views on Woodrow Wilson. And so we've had this we've been planning this for a while. We are recording this in the home stretch of the presidential campaign, but we're not going to talk about any of it. This is counter-programming. But just in case there's something dated that comes up in the conversation, you should know that. But want to talk about the book, want to talk about Woodrow Wilson. And with that, Christopher Cox, welcome to the Remnant.
Well, happy to join you, Jonah.
So, first rule with people, because when I'm on book tour, the question I always like to get, and rarely do, is what's your book about? So, Chris Cox, what's your book about?
Well, in one sentence, it's about Woodrow Wilson, and in particular, his relationship to women's suffrage, which ties directly to his views on race. More broadly, this book is about Wilson and his times, and indeed the times that preceded him. But the Wilson years were an incredibly important period in the history of the country and the history of the world. And his presidency, for that reason, is still influential today, both for what he himself did with the power that he had and for what was happening in the world at that time. If we want to understand World War II and the Cold War that followed it, and today's wars in the Middle East, the running debate over America's chosen role as global superpower. The Wilson years are the fountainhead for all of this. If you want to understand how Jim Crow erupted in the 20th century, long after Reconstruction was a distant memory, then study the Wilson years. Even, I'd say, today's debates over racial justice and gender discrimination that seem to have divided Americans more deeply than ever before, look a little bit more realistic, whether it's a comfort or not, when we go back to the Wilson years, which were far worse. It's important, I think, for all of us to understand just how horrible government policy on race and gender has been in the past if we want to appreciate how and why there's so much attention paid to systemic racism and sexism in our history that still influences America today. And I'd say the same goes for our current debates over free speech. The Wilson years are the outstanding example of the past century when it comes to the government denying free speech and civil liberties to the citizenry. It's painfully instructive to recall what the government did to women peacefully protesting for the right to vote, and to pacifists who opposed the war in their writings and their public speeches. So in this new biography of Wilson, I've focused on Wilson's attitudes and his policies on the proposed constitutional amendment to grant women the right to vote. The 19th Amendment, the Susan B. Anthony Amendment, was one of the most significant events of the 20th century. And in fact, it's one of the greatest advances in the entire history of American democracy. Most of the people listening are probably old enough to remember the millennium, wasn't that long ago. A Gallup poll at the beginning of the 21st century asked the American public to name the most important event of the 20th century, and 66% chose women gaining the right to vote. Ahead of landing a man on the moon, or the fall of the Soviet Union, or World War I, or the Great Depression. Only World War II ranked higher. And yet Wilson's biographies have never treated it that way. It's more than a lacuna in the Wilson story. It's a gaping hole. And it turns out the true story is damned interesting.
So, look, I agree. I have to say, and I warned you going into this, that I often say I am the treasurer of the International Association of the Woodrow Wilson Haters Club. And I've read a lot about Woodrow Wilson, and I never really focused on the women's suffrage
You've
part
written
of
a
it
lot
either.
about Woodrow Wilson,
I
and
have.
it's all
Yeah.
well worth reading.
And thank you. And and I got to say, when I first saw when I got the book, I apologize. It's the busy season with the election and all that, but I'm about 150, 200 pages in. It's great. It's really great. It's really well written. It's very accessible. At the same time, it's very scholarly. I highly recommend it to people. I get asked all the time, what's a good biography about Woodrow Wilson? And I'm not going to give them the Arthur Link 5,000 volume thing. So I will recommend this to people. But when I first saw that you were going to focus sort of the prism through women's suffrage, I was like, really interesting choice. And then I kind of got into it, and I was like, oh, it's actually an interesting choice, and without the sarcasm. And I have to say, the stuff about how really terrible Reconstruction that Woodrow Wilson sort of imbibed is very compelling. There are all sorts of reasons it's not fun reading about a lot of that, but it's important reading. But so why don't we start there? Just sort of like, I want to get to historiography and all sorts of other things, but like, why don't we just sort of start with, who was Woodrow Wilson before he became president? And you can start it and take as much time as you like.
Yeah. So he was a Southerner. He was born in Virginia, but moved as an infant, or at least a very small child, to Georgia first, where he spent most of his boyhood. The family then moved to South Carolina, and after that, North Carolina. He himself, after he went off to school, came back to the South, back to North Carolina, and then back to Georgia. So he ended up spending the better part of 3 decades identifying as a Southerner before, ultimately he landed paying employment up north, really not until he was near 30, and got married and became a professor. Finally, I should say, let me back up.
Sure.
Before he wound up at Princeton, which most people are aware of, he started off his first paying job at a new women's college, Bryn Mawr. And Bryn Mawr was run by a feminist. He didn't want to go to work there. His wife didn't want him to go to work there. He didn't want to teach women, but that was the only job he could get. And because he had only an undergraduate degree, did not have a PhD, which everybody else on the Bryn Mawr faculty did, they didn't even make him an associate professor. He was the only person on the faculty whose title was just associate. So he was the lowest of the low at Bryn Mawr. He hated it there. He hated teaching women and the experience of it. He particularly did not like Carrie Thomas, who was the dean and just his age. She had a PhD. She had earned it in a way that we may get to later in this discussion, that Wilson did not earn his. And she was a real scholar, and she was a real feminist. And she was very much into women voting and women in the professions. And she even went so far as to hire staff for the girls and young women who were in her school, so that they wouldn't have to make their beds, because she wanted to break the stereotype that you had to be a domestic if you were female. And she thought that their time would be better spent in study. So those kinds of things really rubbed Woodrow Wilson the wrong way. He finally got out of there after 4 years and went off to teach at Wesleyan, and then finally made it to what was then called the College of New Jersey to become a professor. And that's where he spent his entire career before going into politics. Very briefly, he served as governor of New Jersey, but that was always meant to be just a springboard for a race to the White House. Served 2 terms in the White House, very, very consequential terms, including, of course, World War I. And the final years of his presidency, very tragic because of the strokes that really laid him low, almost total paralysis on the left side, had very great difficulty functioning for quite a while. And then in the final year of his presidency, he was just truly a changed man. He'd always been stubborn, but he was super stubborn at the end, didn't listen to any of his own advisors, lost the thing that he had ostensibly been fighting for, the League of Nations, got crushed in the 1920 election that he wanted to be a solemn referendum on his own 2 terms as president and on his leadership in the war and on the League of Nations and so on. And it was one of the greatest landslides in American history, went the other way against him. He then, suffered in his few years remaining, which he spent in Washington, D.C. He's the only president to do that up to that point, and died a really pitiful death. So a very tragic ending to that story. And it's one of the reasons that Woodrow Wilson has captured the imagination of biographers and readers for such a long time, because it's almost like Greek tragedy.
Yeah, it's hard to explain to people how much Wilson's star has fallen from its heyday. I mean, Sigmund Freud, the only biography he ever wrote was of Woodrow Wilson. He was a rock star in Europe during the Versailles stuff. There were statues erected to him in front of main, buildings and train stations and that kind of stuff. There are train stations named after him. There's plazas named after him. And then there was this long sort of status quo of him considered one of the greats. I remember in the early 2000s, one of the anniversary issues of the New Republic had essentially it wasn't done like Mount Rushmore, but it was like the greats of liberalism standing on the cover, and it was Martin Luther King, FDR, Woodrow Wilson, and maybe Eleanor Roosevelt or something like that, and that was about it. And now, I mean, the cancellation of Woodrow Wilson has been remarkably sudden in the last, decade or so. How fair do you think that is? I mean, we don't like the cancellation stuff generally. At the same time, I think there's a better historical accounting of who the man was than if you had a better understanding of who the man was, you might not have named as many things after him as they did. Is that fair?
Yeah, I mean, I think that Wilson is affected on the extremes both ways, because there was all of this momentum to create the mythology of Woodrow Wilson that had to be undone eventually by historical scholarship. The early biographies were all hagiographic. He was the greatest man. And actually, it wasn't just the early biographies. It was the Committee on Public Information, the big propaganda mechanism that he established during the second term that he spent in the White House. It has been aptly described as the first and only U.S. government ministry of propaganda. And in the Third Reich, people credited what George Creel had done as their model.
Robert Nisbet said it was the first modern propaganda ministry in Western civilization. I mean, it's like, and it's barely remembered.
But that is why when Wilson went to Europe, we got to see all of this footage, because he brought George Creel with him. Mm-hmm. He brought Hollywood filmmakers with him, and they had primed the pump with all of this expensive government-funded propaganda in these European countries before he arrived. So he was, in Creel's words, the greatest man and the savior of the world. That needed a little toning down, in historical perspective, in fairness. So there's that. Mm-hmm. On the other side, there needs to be a little bit of empathy for the man, because these were different times. And so judging his record we must shed our presentism. We think differently about many things in the second half of the 20th century and the first 3 decades of the 21st. So we have to, and it's also very difficult, I think, because for modern readers, the labels seem very much the same. We've got Republicans, we've got Democrats, we've got progressives, we've got conservatives, but you've got to take off your jersey when you look at this, because you're going to find people in both the Republican Party and the Democratic Party that on certain issues you're going to agree with. And you're also going to find people in both places and all places, because there are other parties, that you find have views that are just absolutely outrageous, atrocious, and you want to stay as far away from those things as possible. So it's a good lesson actually for the present day, because even today we do well to take off our jerseys and look at the issues once in a while, instead of saying this is my team and the other team's always wrong. So that's really the approach that I wanted to take here. The subtitle of the book is The Light Withdrawn, which probably is puzzling until you read the book, but it comes from a poem called Ichabod, written in the mid-19th century by a guy named John Greenleaf Whittier, after whom Whittier, California, here I'm in California right now. But Whittier in California, where Richard Nixon was born, is named after this man. He was a poet, yes, but he was also an abolitionist, and he had long admired Daniel Webster, who was a leader in the Senate in the fight against slavery. But shortly before Webster died, he broke faith with the abolitionists, and he broke millions of American hearts in the process when he supported the fugitive slave law that was at the center of the Compromise of 1850. So that's where the line comes from. In response to that great disappointment, Whittier published this mournful elegy for his former hero, who, as he said, once more, glory is a crown and might have illuminated future ages. And those words seem to me especially appropriate for Woodrow Wilson as we're coming to understand him.
Yeah, so I like. There's a book that I have this sort of love-hate relationship with. I like the authors a great deal. It's The Myth of Left and Right, by Hiram and Verlin Lewis, and it challenges a lot of our sort of understandings of what left and right are and why we still use these things. And I'm a soft supporter of their argument. I don't go nearly as far as they do with it and say we should just throw it away, because I think there is a thing as left and right. But why don't you talk through for listeners, about people like George Creel, Josephus Daniels, Southern progressives, right? Because there is this idea that today, if you call someone a progressive, that means they're the opposite of racist. And yet the sort of whole construct of American progressivism, particularly Southern progressivism, had a much different relationship with race, with eugenics to a certain extent, and so the idea of Woodrow Wilson being a progressive president and also a pretty serious racist is very hard for people to understand, because they think those things have to go together, right? And so why don't you sort of set the stage a little bit about what Wilson's racial attitudes were and those of the people he surrounded himself with.
Yeah, so that's probably the best example of why we need to take our jerseys off when we study this history, because the word progressive is really loaded, and people love the word progressive, or they hate it these days, one or the other. It's your team versus my team and that sort of thing. And it has a certain meaning in the 21st century that it did not have in Wilson's time, in part because progressivism was still in the cauldron. It was being formulated.
Right.
And for better or for worse, Wilson's flaws come to be identified with early progressivism, because while there were many, many progressives who fought Wilson on race, and who fought Wilson on women's suffrage as two big examples. Those progressives didn't become president, and he did.
Right.
And he was president for 2 terms. And so he defined progressivism to a great extent, and therefore blemished progressivism with racism and eugenics. The racism piece was not Wilson exclusively by any means. It was very big among Southern Democrats. You mentioned Josephus Daniels, who served in the Wilson campaign, helped him get elected president in the first place, and then served in his cabinet. He was a major league racist newspaper publisher and responsible for the Wilmington riots that murdered so many black people. It's all been the subject of a retrospective in the 21st century by the North Carolina state government, and they fingered Josephus Daniels as a precipitator of those riots. But besides, and the rest,
And he
of
was
the
proud
cabinet,
of it.
Oh, of course he was. Yes,
Yeah.
he was even proud of lying to his readers about what black people were doing because he wanted to rile them up, and he confessed to that
Yeah.
it wasn't even true what he was writing. So yes, there's some very despicable characters that found their way into Wilson's cabinet by invitation, and we could go down that list if you like. But really, the throwaway to the Wilson cabinet was Southern Democrats, but it was also Northern progressives who were guilty of these sins in many cases, leading example being the 3-time Democratic Party nominee, William Jennings Bryan,
Right.
who, when he died, was feted by Ku Klux Klan chapters across the country who did cross burnings for him. One of them in Ohio, the lit up crosses, spelled out the greatest Klansman of our time. The historical record does not show that he ever actually joined the Ku Klux Klan, but he definitely supported Klan members in elections. They supported him. And at the Democratic Convention, he spoke at great length against a resolution condemning the Klan, which is famously remembered that was after Wilson. So you have Northern progressives, some of them, who are just as guilty as Wilson of extreme racism. And then you have a lot of Northern progressives who are deeply involved in eugenics. And Wilson was schooled in this. When he went to Johns Hopkins, his instructors were very much proponents of a racialized view of history, of making sure that only the proper people were in charge, and then so on. And this is shot through Wilson's own thinking from early days. It's all expressed in his writing. He carried the torch forward in the books that he wrote, and so I think progressivism is stained from that perspective, as we view it as an historical matter. Fast forward to today, and as you say, progressives today are horrified by these things, as should all people be. But we have to say, in fairness, so were a lot of progressives in Wilson's time.
Mm-hmm.
So it's not presentism to criticize Wilson for having these views, because he was confronted constantly by people that were on his side. Many of them were Democrats, some were socialists, some were, to his left in other ways. But he was getting a lot of friendly fire for these views in his own day, and therefore, for that reason, I think can fairly be criticized from our perspective of the 21st century.
Yeah, and it's also, talk about the Team Jersey thing. Progressivism is a very capacious term back then, which includes lots of, as you say, that lots of things that were in conflict with each other. And there were progressives in the Republican Party, and there were progressives in the Democratic Party, but there weren't a lot of, the sort of Dixiecrat crowd was by definition Democratic, because did not want to be a white Republican in the South during a lot of this period, right? And so um, so one of the hopes, of the Dixiecrat crowd was that Wilson was going to restore Southern ways across the country, and they kind of had to settle for resegregating Washington and the federal government. Why don't you just talk us through that a little bit? There's a lot of these ideas that, I remember reading the practice of putting photos of job applicants on job applications started in this period so that government officials in the Wilson administration could tell who was black and therefore not give them a job. I've never been able to quite nail that down, but I remember reading it. Anyway,
that is absolutely true. That started in the Wilson administration. The civil service up until that point was about protecting workers' rights, and in the Wilson years, they abjured anything to do with enforcing civil rights. Said was not their business, and no question they used the photographs as a means of making sure they didn't hire any black people.
Right. So, because I don't want to, there's all sorts of things I want to get into, but I want to be fair to the book and to your to the sort of the central spine of it, which is, race is an important part of it, but really it's the women's suffrage part. So why don't you sort of explain, other than the fact that he didn't like teaching at a women's college, and why he was against, he was against all sorts of universal suffrage things, but particularly against female suffrage. What was the role of the women's suffrage movement in the Wilson years and in his administration, and why did he end up coming down the way he did? What's that story?
Yeah, well, I've seen it as a particularly unfortunate accident of history that Woodrow Wilson came to the White House when he did, from the standpoint of women's suffrage, because the women's suffrage movement had been building for such a long time, and it had reached a point where if he had wanted to, when he became president, he could have pushed it across the finish line. In his campaign for governor in New Jersey, it was an issue. He said he was strongly against it. In his first campaign for the White House in 1912, his leading opponent, Teddy Roosevelt, was all for the Susan B. Anthony Amendment, and he was against it. In 1916, his Republican opponent, Charles Evans Hughes, was all for the Anthony Amendment, and he was against it. Ultimately, he came around to supporting women's suffrage by state decision, because that would protect the right of Southern states with their Jim Crow laws and so on, to have white women only voting. And that was ultimately okay with him. But if we look at Wilson throughout his entire adult life, most of which was spent at Princeton, he wasn't really on board with women voting at all for most of those years. And even in the White House, even on one particular day when he was about to go meet with the leaders of the National American Women's Suffrage Association in the White House, he told a House guest that he didn't want women to vote because he was worried about what it would do to the family structure, the social structure. And he said, who will do the housework? This is while he's in his second term in the White House. So publicly, he went much further and said, if states do it, that's okay. But privately, he was much slower to come around. He had 3 daughters, 2 of whom were pretty active suffragists. One of them even was involved with Alice Paul, who was his antagonist. The other suffragists I mentioned the National American Women's Suffrage Association is quite a mouthful. It went by NASA, so we call it NASA because we can say that. Those people were very solicitous of Wilson and always trying to get his support and never willing to beat him over the head. But the suffragists across the street that eventually called themselves the National Women's Party were much more direct, and they went after Wilson for his opposition. So, we have Wilson's private views and we have Wilson's public view. He didn't come around to the Anthony Amendment, which would have given everybody, every woman in America, the right to vote, until he absolutely had to. It was literally the night before the House of Representatives voted on what became the 19th Amendment with a 2/3 majority. 2/3 of the House of Representatives does not vote for something that is not already publicly popular, and women's suffrage really was then. But it was even when Wilson came to the White House. It was a big phenomenon, and he tried to hold back the tide for as long as he could. Finally, when he came out for the Susan B. Anthony Amendment for the 19th Amendment, he was silent for a very long period. He didn't actually even endorse the women's suffrage amendment himself. At first, he let members of Congress put it out, but then he really restricted what they could say, and he turned down other opportunities to say something favorable about the Anthony Amendment. Then finally, when it was very late in the game and the Senate was about to pass the thing, he was worried they'd do it without him. And so he went and made a speech in the Senate, and it was a very beautiful speech, and said all the right things about women's suffrage. But afterward, privately, he worked with Southern senators to change the wording of the Anthony Amendment that he just made this glorious speech about, so that it would take away federal enforcement, and therefore they could keep their racist laws that would allow only white women to vote. So it's a long and complicated story. He never really got rid of his racism, therefore never really got rid of his worry that black women and black men would vote in the South, and therefore never really got behind the Susan B. Anthony Amendment.
Right. So you, like, if race were not an issue, do you think he would have come around on the women's suffrage stuff earlier, or do you think he still would have been opposed?
If all women in the United States were white, he would have been there.
Yeah. So this gets to Wilson's worldview a little bit. Walter McDougall, historian, he once said, if any trait bubbles up in all one reads about Wilson, it is this: he loved, craved, and in a sense glorified power. And I've always found that a useful way of thinking about Wilson's views on politics is like, he detested Lincoln's ends, but he loved Lincoln's means, which seems to me the exact reversal of how you should think about Lincoln. Lincoln did some regrettable things in order to save the Union and free the slaves, and that was good. The ends were good, but it would be better if you didn't have to suspend habeas corpus or have a war or shut down newspapers, any of that kind of stuff, right? He liked the shutting down the newspapers and all that stuff. He just didn't like the ends. Or, when he was younger, he was more of an advocate of parliamentary system because he could imagine himself doing well in a parliamentary system. When he becomes president, all of a sudden he thinks that no, president needs to be in power. There is this idea that, and he's the only guy who ever run for president or serve as president until then who talked down the Bill of Rights and the U.S. Constitution by saying they were holding us back from doing all of these wonderful things. First of all, so do you agree that there's a power worship aspect to it, so long as he's the one in charge? But also, beyond the word progressive, like how would you explain, in a class about what his actual ideology is? Because his racism seems to be prior to his ideology, right? He picks up that stuff at Hopkins to ratify positions he already held, right? It's like the leading indicator. He was racist before he was a student of Richard Ely and eugenics and race science and all that kind of stuff. What how would you explain what the lodestars of his political philosophy actually were? Because it's hard to explain to people. He ran as the more conservative candidate in many ways in 1912.
Yeah. So it's useful to go back and look at his political formation. In 1912, there was a campaign biography written about Woodrow Wilson that said that he was known as an outspoken Democrat from his first day on campus at the College of New Jersey. And we know what his political thinking was then because he wrote. And actually, the great thing about being a Wilson biographer is the amazing amount of writing that the subject of this biography has done. So we don't have to imagine what he thought about many things because he said what he thought. He published it. And to the extent that his private thoughts were different from what he published, we've also got lots of letters, diaries, and so on. And just an amazingly rich trove of ways to not just infer, but to know to a certainty what was going on in Woodrow Wilson's head. He was a Democrat for one reason. He hated Reconstruction.
Mm-hmm.
And he said so when he was a college student. He said so when he was on the Princeton faculty. He said so while he was the Princeton president. He's written elaborately about what was wrong with construction, and specifically what was wrong with Reconstruction was that it allowed ignorant Negroes, as he called them, to vote. This universal suffrage was a constant element of weakness, he said, when he was a student, and we needed to purge the constituencies of their ignorant elements if we would have high-minded, worthy representatives for ourselves in Congress. And he went further and he said that that black men voting was the cause of every evil in American government. It's to be found in the principle of universal suffrage. So he was, and his opposition to Republican candidates, which he spelled out as a student, was founded upon their support for black men voting. That's why he was a Democrat. And of course, the Democratic Party was very supportive of that Southern point of view in those years. Fast forward to, well, actually, you don't have to fast forward. You can stick around in college for a moment because he wrote an essay while he was still a 22-year-old student that he published in a magazine called the International Review. His editor, ironically, was Henry Cabot Lodge, who was also in his 20s at the time, his ultimate nemesis in the Senate when it came to the League of Nations. But Lodge published this essay called Cabinet Government, which to somebody who has served in Congress for 9 terms is just a preposterous thing, what he wrote. It was very wrong when he wrote it in the 19th century. It remains wrong. There's really nothing about it that's even close to accurate. And it's not surprising because he never went to Congress to look and see what was going on there, even though he was not that far away. He didn't go later when he wrote a whole book length version of this same idea that he laid out in cabinet government. He never set foot in Congress, according to the U.S. Senate historian, until after his book was published. And yet, without any original research, he found out what was wrong with American government and the legislative branch in particular. So what he said after he got done in this student essay complaining about universal suffrage, is that there was a deeper problem, and that is that the Constitution designed a system in which the legislative branch was despotic and dangerous. And to remedy this fundamental constitutional defect, Wilson proposed that the leaders of Congress report to the executive in the way that in Britain members of Parliament served the Prime Minister as cabinet officers, and the President's cabinet members would sit in Congress and take the place of congressional committees, which he thought were worthless. And they would control the introduction of legislation. Well, of course, not only would this sort of system, make Wilson, if he were president, enormously powerful, but it would have prevented Congress from enacting Reconstruction over Johnson's vetoes, which was the lived experience that caused him to adopt this view in the first place. So borrowing ideas from Bagehot, who he was mostly copying from in his description of the British government, seemed to him a very simple solution to this domineering Republican Congress that was forcing Reconstruction on the South. He acknowledged, when people reviewed what he wrote, that this would perhaps put too much authority, too much control within the reach of the central government. But he had this really flimsy explanation. He said that it would make it more transparent. It would make the government operations more transparent, because now, if they were handled under the control of the executive branch instead of these congressional committees, everything would be in a constant stream of daylight, as if the operations of both the British and American governments at the time were not, totally veiled in secrecy when it came to at least 50% of what they did. The executive branches, particularly in Britain, at that time, was very sophisticated about keeping secrets and doing all sorts of things that Wilson eventually ran into in World War I, when he found out about the secret treaties that they'd made, when he found out about the plan to divide up the Middle East, and so on. So Wilson's naivete about the operations of both the British and American governments at the time, comes out in his writings throughout his years at Princeton, as well as when he was a student. It was a constant theme. Congressional Government was written when he was 27 years old, or thereabouts. His first book, Congressional Government, came along. I'm trying to think of when the Congress was operating women's suffrage committees, but I think it was at the same time. So he was complaining about the worthlessness of congressional committees at the very time that the congressional system, not the executive branch, was adapting itself to women's suffrage becoming a big issue. And they formed committees in both the House and the Senate, women's suffrage committees, to take it up. They actually voted in the Senate on it, and so on. And during Reconstruction, of course, women did get the vote, first in Wyoming and then in Utah, under territorial governors appointed by President Grant. So these were Reconstruction era things that were part and parcel of what Woodrow Wilson hated, and why he was the way he was in politics.
I have, as the kids might say, receipts on Woodrow Wilson that I just want to ask you some questions about. Some of which are, we can sort of start there, and that some of it, for people who think that this is might accuse you of writing an unfair book, I think you bend over backwards to be fair to the guy. And at least from what I've seen, I've been going in and out of your index scanner. What does he say about this guy? Because again, I'm a anti-Wilson nerd. And there are things that you've left out from the story. Obviously, as an editorial choice about the story, one of the things that
it's 500 pages, so I
of course, yeah, no, it's not a criticism per se. It's like no one ever, people write the books they want to write, and one of the criticisms I hate from people is, why didn't you write about the thing I wanted you to write about? Was like, because I wrote about. I'm the one who actually had to put my name on the book, and I wrote about the things I wanted to write about. So I don't hold it against you, but like, this is, did you read the Adam Hochschild book, American Midnight?
Yes, I did.
That, I have some great problems with that book too. I mean, actually, I shouldn't say two. That makes it sound wrong. I have, I have disagreements with Hochschild insofar as there is this habit in American historiography about Wilson that when bad things happen when Wilson is president, Wilson disappears from the story, right? So when the Palmer raids happen, right? It's like all of a sudden 50 pages in some books about the Wilson years without Woodrow Wilson popping up anywhere in there, right? And one of my problems with the way Hochschild does it is that one of my big grievances with liberal historiography is that when bad things happen in American history, it's either because conservatives did it, the American right, traditionalists, whoever, or if you can't pin it on conservatives, you say, well, then it's part of America itself. The very nature of America is to blame here. Very little liberal historiography actually wants to blame the progressives or the Democrats in charge of the government and in charge of things when the government does bad things. Then it's a indictment about America itself, and progressivism or liberalism is always blameless. You don't do that, which I appreciate. But you don't mention the Wobblies. There's not a lot of stuff about the Red Scare and all of that. And there are things, Wilson's war on civil rights in terms of what he did to Germans, or at least what the government did, to German Americans. I mean, the one thing you can say in defense of it is that it at least made it more racially diverse, the oppressions from the U.S. government by going after German Americans. But anyway, I don't want to filibuster here.
Yeah, so I like the point though, because this is what I discovered. There is obviously a great deal that's been written about Woodrow Wilson and books like American Midnight that have come out even contemporaneously with this one. And particularly as you go back, I absolve modern writers for the most part of doing this to a fault, but to a fault, Wilson's early biographers and biographers throughout the 20th century were making him, where's Waldo? How come he doesn't get blamed? When bad things happened, it was some cabinet guy that went off and did it and embarrassed Wilson or something. My book, as you have amply pointed out, is focused on women's suffrage. Mm-hmm. And in the writings about women's suffrage that are extant, prior to this book, the same thing, could be seen. We have these women that are virtually tortured in jail and so on, and they haven't done anything illegal. So they shouldn't be in jail in the first place. And once they're in jail, they're being beaten and so on. And was Wilson in any way responsible for this? So in the book, I went into a great deal of research to find out, what was Wilson's relationship to the DC government at the time? Was he, cognizant of this? Was he directing it? Was he oblivious to it, or what have you? And in fact, Wilson's control of the DC government was complete. Mm-hmm. It was both legal and personal. By statute, Congress delegated its control over the city to the executive branch. The president appointed a 3-member board of commissioners who reported directly to him. The law required that one of the 3 come from the Army Corps of Engineers, and that guy we never heard much from. But the chair of this 3-person board was always one of the other 2, and Wilson filled the other 2 slots with loyal friends, journalists. Mm-hmm. One was Oliver Peck Newman, who had been the chief editorial writer for the Washington Times. During Wilson's 1912 campaign, he'd been assigned by the Scripps and United Press syndicates to accompany the candidate. So Newman shadowed Wilson until Inauguration Day and even joined him on his post-election vacation. All the while he's writing flattering stories about the candidate, and their relationship grows so friendly that while the journalist was ostensibly covering Wilson, he was also serving as campaign advisor. And in fact, it was Newman who advised Wilson the day after his election that he should deliver his presidential addresses to Congress in person, and thereby become the first president to do that since John Adams. Wilson's other political appointee on this D.C. Board of Commissioners is a guy named Louis Brownlow, and he was an equally friendly journalist who, like the president and like most of the president's cabinet, they were all sons of Confederate officers whose families had once kept slaves. Brownlow fit that profile. He was an admirer and an acquaintance of Wilson's supremacist professor at Johns Hopkins, whom you mentioned, Richard T. Ely. As a young man, Brownlow had eagerly consumed Wilson's articles criticizing Reconstruction in the Atlantic. Years later, when he worked for Wilson, he admitted that he never during those years had really ever escaped his heritage of race prejudice. So Brownlow had been an editorial writer for 3 different Kentucky newspapers, and when he was the state political editor for the Nashville Banner, he hired and trained Woodrow Wilson's brother, Joe Wilson, and that's when he first met the future president, who was at the time the president of Princeton. And they enjoyed several long talks at the time, and that formed the basis of their decades-long relationship. On top of that, Brownlow and Newman were each other's closest friends. So we have this clique of close friends, Wilson included, who had legal and practical control of the D.C. police, the jails, the city attorneys, and everything that happened in D.C. government. Wilson and Brownlow, by the way, served as vice chairs of Wilson's inaugural committee. They used to lunch at the New Willard Hotel near the White House. They had this gang of people that included the D.C. Superintendent of Police, a guy named Ray Pullman, and the heads of some of the federal agencies and the support of journalists that they freely admitted to their group. And they used to munch on the free donuts at the Willard, and that gave them their name as Wilson's Donut Cabinet. So this is the combination of the president's explicit legal authority and his personal relationship with these appointees that gave him unfettered power to deploy the police, to arrest the suffragists. And so these people are coming in and out of the White House, talking to him, talking to his chief of staff, who they called the White House secretary, Joe Tumulty, making the decisions about whether to arrest the women, whether we should prosecute them, whether we should pardon them, all of these things. Wilson was making these, and whether they should be force-fed. Wilson personally was involved in all of this. And likewise, the decisions to forcibly suppress dissent in the nation's capital when people came to protest the war. A lot of pacifists had supported him in the 1916 election because he was the guy that kept us out of war. He was the peace candidate, and a few weeks after his inauguration, he asked Congress for a declaration of war. They all come to Washington. They want to protest the war decision. They want to protest the draft, and he bans all demonstrations in Washington. And you're arrested if you protest in any peaceful way that ought to have been legal. So he had this power to control what went on in the nation's capital police-wise, and increasingly, this started in 1912 with early protests on women's suffrage, and it carried through when the war started. So it was a steady increase during his years in office that he used this power, but his fingerprints are all over it. And if I have any criticism of the books that have told this story before of how women were abused for protesting for the right to vote, it's that they tread too lightly on Wilson himself. pretty much, repeating the earlier writings that, somebody else must have done it because, we don't think Woodrow Wilson would have done this.
Right. It's sort of as my people used to say, if only the czar knew.
Right.
This wouldn't be happening.
Right.
Something you don't get into very much, but do you have a sense of how much Wilson's fingerprints were on the American Protective League and all that it was doing as sort of semi-official way to beat down dissent over the war and all of that? Because it's one of these things that was so memory hold that even now when I go back and I reread some of the history of it, I'm like, could this really have happened in America? But in my book, I originally said that It Can't Happen Here was kind of an ironic title because it was kind of actually about what did happen during World War One. But it's very hard to find fingerprints in the histories I've read about the American Protective League.
Yeah. One thing we know for certain about Woodrow Wilson is that he never forgave his enemies,
Mm-hmm.
ever. And then that even included his very closest friends. There are two people in the book that are major characters that fall into this category. Both men whom he had, very friendly relations with. Somewhat unusual for a man, Woodrow Wilson, who didn't have that many really close friends. And yet, when they crossed him, or he thought they crossed him, they didn't think they crossed him. They thought they were giving their best advice. He not only fired them, but he never spoke to them again. And in both cases, he instructed his second wife, Edith, to make sure that they didn't come to the funeral, and she followed his wishes. So he was a vindictive person who had enemies. We think of Richard Nixon or even Donald Trump in this way. I would say that on that scale, that Wilson was right up there near 100%.
All right, so this is one of these receipt things. I'm always interested if people know anything about Wilson to get their take on it. When I was in high school and college, Wilson was synonymous with making the world safe for democracy, Wilsonian internationalism. I used to work for Ben Wattenberg, who was a big foreign policy Wilsonian and all these things. And my own view is that self-determination is not the same thing as democratization, right? And at Versailles, the idea was to sort of break up the empires and let various peoples, various nations decide for themselves how to live. But that didn't. But the process of self-determination didn't necessarily need to be democratic. And if you read some of his stuff about the development of nations and Aryan peoples are capable of this kind of government, but these kinds of peoples aren't capable of that kind of government. It was much more of a sort of identity politics form of international theory. At least that's how I read it. But there are lots of people who disagree with me, serious people, who say, no, self-determination was about democracy. But you just have to look at it in the nuanced context of the time. And I'm just sort of wondering, do you have a strong opinion one way or the other on that?
Yeah, I think I'm with you on that, on your interpretation, because Wilson, again, we don't have to infer what he thought. He said what he thought, and he believed that certain people were not ready for self-government. And so his idea of self-determination might have been to keep people separate along ethnic lines. That's the kind of line drawing they all got involved in at the Paris Peace Conference, and that they embodied in the Versailles Treaty. But even as late as Versailles, even as late as Paris, he was standing athwart any kind of language, no matter how bland, that the Japanese wanted to put in into the League of Nations Charter to protect against racial discrimination. So he never gave up these views. He never believed other than that, ignorant suffrage was a problem, and that some races, particularly Anglo-Saxon white men, are superior and therefore entitled to govern. So you have to square those two separate views to understand what he meant when he's talking about self-determination and when he's talking about democracy. He was very capable of missing the main point when he's talking about democracy, because remember what the women were doing out in front of the White House. They're holding up his speeches. They can just cut and paste from his speeches and put it on their signs. All they wanted was to have a voice in their own government. He went out to California when he was running for president and spoke to the Jefferson Club in Los Angeles and told them that when they read the Declaration of Independence, they should not pay any attention to the preamble. That's the least part of it, because that's the part that says that people are created equal, and he wasn't there.
I'm going to find that speech because I'm always looking for new reasons to dislike Woodrow Wilson.
Oh, you haven't heard? I can't believe I came up with one.
That's a good one. I didn't know that one. That's a keeper. Okay. I know I got to let you go, but two sort of related questions. One is the failure of the rejection of the Treaty of Versailles by Republicans is often sort of name-checked, quite, in my opinion, quite glibly by some journalists and intellectuals as Exhibit A of the American isolationist tradition. And I'm not an isolationist, full stop, right? But and I have no disputing that there were isolationist arguments against the Treaty of Versailles and against the League of Nations, and that's all fine. But Henry Cabot Lodge, I don't think, was an isolationist, and there were all sorts of mutual defense things that he wanted in a separate treaty that got voted down that I would argue were not the things that a pure isolationist would want. But the spin about the fall of Versailles and how it arguably led to World War II has been pinned on Republicans and the right for a very, very, very long time as sort of an original sin of conservative foreign policy. And my own view is I think the history is more complicated than that. And I'm just sort of wondering, where do you come down on that?
Yeah. So again, we have a lot of historical record to deal with here. And so we shouldn't be too much at sea about what is the answer to this question. Wilson, in the end, was the reason that the League of Nations failed.
Right.
Democrats were prepared to vote for it. They were instructed to vote against it. Very bizarre thing. The leader of the Democrats in the Senate on this subject, who went and met one of the few people that had access to the president, met with him personally in his bed, was instructed. He was there to beg the president to send word to the Senate that he would support what were called mild reservations proposed by the mild reservationists that included Henry Cabot Lodge.
Right.
Because this would in no way require renegotiation of the treaty. Reservations were different than treaty amendments. Wouldn't have to re-vote anything. Britain and France had already signed off on it in advance. Everything is ready to go. All you have to do is say yes. And by the account of Ray Stannard Baker, who was very much involved at this time in writing about what actually happened. He had been press secretary for Wilson over at Versailles, and wrote very compendious multi-volume biography of Wilson afterward. And he described how the president was just adamant every time the Democrats in the Senate would come and beg him to change, and he would say, he would just harden. He'd say, "No, I'm not going to give an inch," and he kicked away his own creation. The fundamental thing that the reservations were aimed at was the constitutional power of Congress to declare war. That was the most fundamental thing they wanted to clarify. And there's really no way around that. I mean, you know, accepting that was merely accepting the Constitution, because the war-making power is very clear in Article 1. So, yeah, I mean, blaming this on the mild reservationists as opposed to blaming it on Wilson is counterfactual.
Okay. Last, kind of curious. I mean, you're out of politics.
Long time. I left Congress in 2005.
And I'm just going to
totally recovered, Jonah.
And I promised that we weren't going to talk about contemporary politics at all. But I am just going to assert, on just leap of faith, blind conviction, that you are still something of a Reaganite, or at least sympathetic to that form of Republican Party. And again, I'm not setting you up to opine about contemporary politics. I do have a question, though, about conservative intellectual history. And when I was working on my first book, and I had this thesis about Wilson that, basically a lot of things started with Wilson, a lot of problems. What was interesting is I was an obsessive reader of the archives of National Review and of Human Event, old conservative publications, old conservative writers. And one of the things that gets very confusing about pre-World War II conservatism, or the pre-World War II right, is that it was kind of a dog's breakfast with a lot of different weird, cranky characters. And H.L. Mencken wasn't necessarily, he was sui generis, right? And but what was interesting is that there was virtually no criticism of Woodrow Wilson in the early pages of National Review or on the right more broadly. It was basically that the story of America's lurch leftward begins with FDR. And the Wilson years were ancient history. And as you know, the FDR administration was really a continuation in many ways of the Wilson administration. It was full of Wilson retreads. FDR himself was a Wilson retread. And there was just this blurring out. And so I get why liberal historians and the hagiography that we were talking about earlier about Wilson, but why is it that it took so long, do you think, for conservatives to say, hey, this story actually starts a little earlier than FDR, and put him into the narrative? Do you have any idea about why for 50 years of sort of post-World War II conservatism, there really just wasn't a lot of talk about Wilson, except in a few special corners of the right?
Well, as we were discussing earlier in the podcast, Wilson was up in the clouds. He was sainted. So the history books all said so. The movie that came out in the 1950s about Woodrow Wilson was the most expensive movie produced to date and won Academy Awards and so on. All of this lionizing of this man was the premise on which everyone operated. It was a shared premise. It's what everybody in America thought. Life magazine had pronounced him, up there with Washington and Lincoln and so on. So it made sense, perhaps. I don't know. I was born in the Truman administration, so anything that happened before that, I'm not personally familiar with, and even the Truman administration, I was a little young for. I don't know beyond that, but it seems reasonable to me to suspect that that big wave of momentum that Wilson was riding spared him from some of what should have been more searching criticism.
Yeah, I mean, part of my theory about it, and you'd probably agree with at least some of it to one degree or another, is that modern American conservatism begins after World War II, essentially, and it's formed in the Cold War. And you had Wilson, who was going after communists, right? And you had and covering himself with the trappings of patriotism, and so it felt a little like a precursor to Cold War logic, and that bought him a little bit more of a pass than he deserved, because what he did to Eugene V. Debs, what he did to the suffragists, what he did to there were a lot of political prisoners in effect in the United States under Wilson.
Yeah, I mean, that's the part that I suppose had to be rediscovered, and that was overlooked for so long. The men and women who opposed Wilson's war policy went to jail, and they stayed there until the war was over. We had the Espionage Act and later the Sedition Act, and the sweep of those laws, as they were implemented by the Wilson administration, censored the speech of newspaper and magazine editors to an extent that in many cases the publications had to go out of business, and their owners went to prison. We've been talking about women protesting peacefully in silence, holding signs with only Wilson's words on them, being locked up for 6 and 7 months at a time and horribly abused by their jailers. This is very authoritarian stuff. Black men and women were refused passports to leave the country because of their political views and because of their race. And yet, we have Wilson routinely labeled as a progressive president. That gets us back to our labels problem, the fact that we're able to see so clearly now what his political opponents saw then, that his policies on women's voting rights, on citizens' rights to be heard, on racial equality, on freedom of speech, these were all anything but progressive. That should serve as a lesson to us, not to take us too much into the present day, but it's hard not to infer these lessons. Should serve as a lesson to us about the danger of using simplistic labels like conservative, whatever the hell that means these days, to identify who are political friends and foes.
All right, Christopher Cox, thank you so much for doing this. The book, again, is Woodrow Wilson, The Light Withdrawn, and we'll put links up to it in the show notes and all that. And thank you so much for doing this.
All right, thanks. If I can, I'll give a plug for a website, www.lightwithdrawn.com, because if you go, that's the book's website, has its own website. But if you go there, you're going to see some 50 photographs, color photographs, carefully restored from the 19th century and in early 20th. A lot of the characters are in the book. So it's very amazing stuff that Simon & Schuster helped me work on. And that's a fun part of the book.
I will endorse that. The photos, I mean, normally we don't have a lot of authors where I say you got to get the book for the pictures. But the pictures are great. They really are. And the book is great. So thank you again, Christopher Cox, for being here.